What if I told you that a race built up for months as the greatest 400-meter showdown in years ended in one of the most anticipated collapses track and field has seen in a decade? A 16, now 18-year-old phenom who was supposed to chase history. A college superstar who had just run the fourth fastest 400 meters ever recorded by a human being. An Olympic champion looking for one last moment of magic. All three lined up on the same track, in front of a crowd buzzing with the kind of energy usually reserved for World Championship finals. And then, nothing happened. No records. No sub-44. No fireworks. Just silence where history was supposed to be written. Stick around, because by the end of this video you're going to understand exactly why the 400 meters is the single cruelest event in all of track and field, why almost nobody, not even Usain Bolt, has ever dared to master it, and why the night everyone expected to be legendary turned into one of the strangest anticlimaxes of the entire season. Before we get into it, if you're into deep dive breakdowns of track and field's biggest moments, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we're covering every major meet this season, and you do not want to miss what's coming next. Alright, let's get into the race that had the entire track world talking for weeks. Let's start with a number that sounds almost impossible once you actually sit with it. In the entire recorded history of the sport, only 32 men have ever run the 400 meters in under 44 seconds. 32. Ever. To put that in perspective, 232 men have broken 10 seconds in the 100 meters, according to World Athletics. That's already an exclusive club, but a big one compared to what we're talking about here. In the 200 meters, 130 men have gone under 20 seconds. So already you can see the pattern. As the distance grows, the club shrinks dramatically. But then you get to the 400, and the number doesn't just shrink, it falls off a cliff. 32 men. In the history of the sport, that is how rare a sub-44 400-meter run actually is. Think about how many elite sprinters have existed since electronic timing became standard. Think about every Olympics, every World Championship, every professional season for the last several decades. And out of all of that, only 32 men have ever crossed that particular threshold. Most seasons, across the entire globe, produce maybe one or two sub-44 performances, and they almost always happen on the very biggest stages: an Olympic final, a World Championship final, a marquee Diamond League meet. Seeing a 43 on the clock in a 400-meter race is one of the rarest sights in the entire sport. It's the kind of moment commentators lose their voice over. So why is the 400 meters such a brutal outlier? Why does it punish athletes in a way the 100 and 200 simply don't? The answer comes down to what the race actually demands from the human body. The 400 meters requires something almost contradictory. It wants raw top-end speed, the kind you need to fly through a 100 or 200-meter race. But it also wants the ability to survive a wall of fatigue and lactic acid buildup that hits hardest in the final 100 meters. Sprinters who look absolutely unbeatable over the shorter distances often completely fall apart in the last stretch of a 400 because their bodies simply were not built or trained to handle that specific kind of suffering. This is exactly why even the greatest sprinter who has ever lived, Usain Bolt, never seriously pursued a competitive 400-meter time. It wasn't a lack of talent. It's that the training required to become elite at 400 meters would have wrecked the explosive short sprint speed that made him the fastest human alive over 100 meters. The two disciplines pull an athlete's body in almost opposite directions. Mastering one often means sacrificing the other. That's part of why the 400 is sometimes called the most unforgiving event in the sport. It demands a level of physical and mental toughness that very few athletes on Earth actually possess. So when a loaded field of Olympic champions, national record holders, and a teenage phenom lined up for the men's 400 meters at the Ed Murphy Classic in Memphis, the excitement wasn't just about watching a fast race. Fans genuinely believed they were about to watch history happen in real time. Let's talk about the athletes who made this race feel so massive, starting with the name that had been building buzz for years, Quincy Wilson. At just 16 years old, Wilson qualified for the 2024 Olympic team as part of the 4x400 relay pool. He didn't even get to run in the final. He only competed in the heats, but Team USA went on to win gold anyway. That single detail made Wilson the youngest American male track and field Olympian in history, and by extension, an Olympic gold medalist before he was even old enough to vote. Just sit with that for a second. Most 16-year-olds are worrying about a driver's permit. Wilson was standing on an Olympic podium. That same year, Wilson set the world under 18 best in the 400 meters, running a stunning 44.20 in Florida. That alone would have been enough to make him a story for years. But a year later, at this exact same meet, the Ed Murphy Classic, he lowered that mark even further, running 44.10 to beat a stacked professional field that included a former Olympic champion. Let that sink in. An active teenager beating grown, professional, Olympic-caliber athletes. That performance made Wilson the second fastest under 20 athlete in history, trailing only one man, Steve Lewis, who ran an almost mythical 43.87 to win Olympic gold as a 19-year-old, all the way back in 1988. Nearly 40 years later, that record still hasn't fallen. Wilson's path to this level started early. He began running track at just 8 years old, and by the time he reached high school at Bullis School in Maryland, he was already breaking national records. His presence on a starting line became so intimidating that other high schoolers reportedly looked beaten before the gun even fired. That's the kind of aura that gets built over years of dominance, not overnight. He carried that dominance across 2 straight seasons of record-breaking runs, 44.20 in 2024, then 44.10 in 2025, both of them, interestingly, set right here in Memphis at this same meet. Wilson wrapped up his high school career this past spring, and for most of it, he looked completely unbeatable. But his final high school race in the Open 400 didn't go the way the script demanded. At the U.S. Under-20 Championships, Wilson ran 44.84, a genuinely excellent time for an 18-year-old, but he finished second, behind a rising talent named Jaden Dion, who won the race in 44.52. For a runner who had barely tasted defeat throughout his entire high school career, that loss stung. And a lot of fans and analysts expected exactly that kind of sting to fuel something big heading into Memphis. Nothing motivates a dominant athlete quite like a rare loss. Ogotsi is a 20-year-old Nigerian sprinter who capped off an enormous collegiate season at the University of Alabama by winning back-to-back NCAA titles in the 400 meters. At this year's NCAA championships in Eugene, Oregon, Ogotsi exploded to a time of 43.38, absolutely shattering Michael Norman's collegiate record of 43.61, a mark that had stood since 2018. Think about that for a second. Michael Norman is one of the most talented 400-meter runners this century has produced, and his collegiate record stood for the better part of a decade before Ogotsi tore through it. That run didn't just make Ogotsi a college legend. It moved him to 4th on the all-time world list, behind only 3 names. World record holder Wade Van Niekerk at 43.03, the legendary Michael Johnson at 43.18, and Butch Reynolds at 43.29. To put Ogotsi's time in real-world context, his 43.38 would have actually won the 2024 Olympic final in Paris, where Quincy Hall took gold in 43.40. A college athlete running a time that would have beaten the reigning Olympic champion. That's the kind of stat that stops conversations in their tracks. Ogotsi didn't just stumble into that time either. He built toward it methodically across the season, running 44.02, then 43.95, then 43.82, steadily chipping away before finally breaking through with the 43.38 at Nationals. That's the profile of an athlete peaking at exactly the right moment. And his rise didn't stop with American record books. That same run in Eugene also broke Nigeria's national record, a mark that had stood for close to 30 years, and pushed him to 6th on the all-time African list. For a country with such a proud sprinting tradition, that made Ogotsi a genuine national story back home, not just a college standout in America, but a symbol of something bigger for Nigerian athletics. The Ed Murphy Classic carried extra weight for Ogotsi too, because it marked his very first race as a professional. Stepping straight out of college glory and into a stacked international field that included an Olympic champion and one of the most talked-about teenagers in the sport. That's about as intense a professional debut as you could possibly script. But Wilson and Ogotsi were far from the only storylines in this race. Grenada's Karani James, the 2012 Olympic champion, lined up looking for one more big performance late in his career. Even in his 30s, James remains a dangerous closer, the kind of veteran who can hurt you in the final 50 meters if you're not careful. His experience made him a genuine wildcard against a field full of much younger legs. Jamaica's Antonio Watson and American Randolph Ross also entered in strong form, rounding out what became one of the deepest 400-meter lineups of the entire 2026 season. There was even a subplot happening back at the NCAA championships that added extra fuel to the fire heading into Memphis. Georgia freshman Jonathan Sims finished second behind Ogotsi with a personal best of 43.92, becoming just the second man in history to break 44 seconds as a junior-aged athlete, joining Steve Lewis all the way back in 1988. His Georgia teammate rounded out an all-Georgia podium in third place with a 44.20. Sims wasn't entered in the Memphis field, but his rise added to a growing feeling across the sport that 2026 was shaping up to be one of the fastest 400-meter seasons ever run. With that much collective talent on one starting line, expectations heading into Memphis were sky-high. Fans pointed to the warm, humid conditions, a notoriously fast track, and Wilson's well-documented track record of running his best times late in the summer season. This was, after all, the exact same meet where he had run 44.10 the year before. Plenty of people expected another personal best from the 18-year-old, maybe even his first run under the sacred 44-second barrier. Ogotsi, meanwhile, was the clear betting favorite given his collegiate record, and plenty of people wondered whether the jump into professional racing could actually push him even faster than his already blistering 43.38. Add in a two-time Olympic medalist in Kirani James and a hungry, motivated Randolph Ross, and this had every ingredient of a race capable of shaking up the entire season, or maybe even threatening history itself. Online forums and running message boards buzzed for days leading into the meet, with fans debating who would break 44 first and whether this could finally be the night a teenager did the unthinkable. Samuel Ogotsi did win the men's 400 at the Ed Murphy Classic, but in a far more modest time than anyone expected. He crossed the line in 44.57, more than a full second slower than his NCAA record performance just weeks earlier. Antonio Watson took second in 44.70, and Kirani James rounded out the podium in 45.04. Solid times, sure, respectable by almost any normal standard, but nowhere near the fireworks fans had spent weeks hyping themselves up for. And as for Quincy Wilson, the night simply didn't go as planned. He finished 7th in 45.53, well off his personal best of 44.10, and nowhere close to the sub-44 barrier so many people expected him to chase down. Randolph Ross finished 6th in 45.48. Gabriel Maranta placed 4th in 45.22, and Delano Kennedy closed out the field in 45.82. There was no world record. There was no sub-44 performance from anyone in the entire field. After months of build-up surrounding two of the most talked-about 400-meter runners on the planet, the most hyped showdown of the summer turned into one of the more forgettable races of the entire season. Now that you understand what happened in Memphis, it's worth stepping back and looking at just how unusual this event has always been. Because the story of the 400 meters is really the story of a handful of athletes who managed to do something almost nobody else in human history has done. The current world record belongs to Wade van Niekerk of South Africa, who ran an astonishing 43.03 at the 2016 Rio Olympics, breaking a record that had stood since 1999 when Michael Johnson ran 43.18 at the Seville World Championships. Johnson's time was considered untouchable for so long that many assumed it might never fall. It took 17 years and a runner in an unusual lane draw. Van Niekerk ran from lane 8 in Rio, meaning he couldn't see any of his competitors ahead of him, to finally break it. Before Johnson, the record belonged to Butch Reynolds, who ran 43.29 in 1988, a time that itself stood for over a decade before Johnson topped it. Reynolds' record came during an era when American sprinters largely dominated the 400 meters on the world stage, a tradition that runners like Quincy Hall and Michael Norman have carried into the present day. Steve Lewis, the name that keeps coming up throughout Wilson's story, deserves his own spotlight here. Back in 1988, at just 19 years old, Lewis won Olympic gold in Seoul with a time of 43.87, a run that made him, for decades, the standard against which every young 400-meter talent would be measured. The fact that Quincy Wilson is now the second fastest under 20 athlete in history, sitting only behind a record that has survived since before Wilson's own parents were likely born, tells you everything about how difficult that mark has been to approach, let alone break. He was 17 years old, standing in front of 10,000 people, and he lost. Not to a legend. Not to Usain Bolt. He lost to a man nobody had picked to beat him, by 0.04 of a second. The width of a shoe. The crowd went home talking about someone else's name. Most people would have folded right there. Instead, this teenager went quiet for weeks, went back to the same small track, the same coach, the same unglamorous drills, and 13 months later, he did something no human being his age has ever done. He ran a time that made Usain Bolt himself pick up the phone. By the end of this video, you will know exactly how a soccer-loving refugee's son from outside Brisbane became the fastest teenager who has ever lived, and why the man who beat him is now the one looking over his shoulder. Before we get into it, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We cover the biggest rising stars in world athletics before the mainstream media even notices them, and this channel is about to be full of names you'll be hearing for the next decade. Drop a like if you're ready, and let's go back to where this all started. March 2025, Lakeside Stadium, Melbourne. 10,000 tickets, sold out. The first sellout crowd at a one-day Australian athletics meet since 2001. Over 1.2 million people tuned in on television for a domestic track meet, which almost never happens in Australia. And every single one of them was there for one reason: a 17-year-old high schooler named Gout Gout. He walked out in a red Adidas tracksuit, and the stadium lost its mind before he'd even taken a single stride. This was his first ever senior 200-meter race. Not junior, not under 18, senior, against grown men who had represented their country at the Olympics. One of those men was Lachlan Kennedy, 4 years older than Gout, raised in Queensland just like him, and 9 days earlier he had won silver in the 60 meters at the World Indoor Championships in Nanjing, China. His personal best over 200 meters sat at 21.19 seconds. Nobody in that stadium expected Kennedy to win this race. Everybody was there to watch the kid. He exploded out of the blocks, tore through the bend, built a lead, and refused to give it up. He crossed the line in 20.26 seconds, smashing his own personal best by almost a full second and running the 5th fastest 200 meters in Australian history. Gout crossed in 20.30, 0.04 of a second behind. The width of a shoe. Afterward, Kennedy admitted it himself: "I knew he was coming. My goal was just to hold him off. 5 more meters and he would have had me." Gout didn't complain. He didn't make excuses. He walked straight over to Kennedy and hugged him. To reporters, he said something that told you everything about how he was wired. That is what you live for. This environment, the hype, the people, the pressure. This is sport. But something shifted in him that night. Not anger, not panic, just a quiet decision that nobody in that stadium could see yet. To understand what happened next, you have to go back further, long before Melbourne, before spikes, before any of it. Gout Gout was born on December 29, 2007, in Ipswich, Queensland. His parents, Bona and Monica, had fled South Sudan during the Civil War. They escaped first to Egypt, and then, in 2005, 2 years before Gout was born, they made it to Australia, looking for nothing more dramatic than a safe place to raise a family. Gout grew up as one of 7 children, in a house 40 kilometers outside Brisbane that had absolutely nothing to do with athletics. Nobody in that family was thinking about world records. He was a soccer kid. Track wasn't even on his radar. Then, in 2020, in his very first year at Ipswich Grammar School, everything changed on one ordinary afternoon at a school sports carnival. He had never worn a pair of spikes in his life. He had never trained for sprinting a single day. He just lined up and ran. And every coach standing on that field stopped whatever they were doing to watch. One of them was Diane Shepherd. She pulled him aside that day and told him something nobody had ever told him before: that he could be great. One sentence. That's all it took to change the entire direction of a kid's life. What followed wasn't a slow, steady rise. It was a straight vertical line. By age 14, Gout was already running 10.57 seconds in the 100 meters and 21.14 in the 200 meters. both Australian under 16 records. This wasn't fast for his age. This was historically, statistically fast, full stop. At 16, he ran 20.04 seconds in the 200 meters. That single run broke a record set by Peter Norman at the 1968 Mexico City Olympics, a mark that had survived for 56 years untouched. Usain Bolt himself saw the footage, jumped on Instagram, and wrote 4 words that went around the world: "Gout looks like young me." Adidas signed him to a professional contract before he had even finished high school. He was 16 years old with a shoe deal and a growing global fan base, and he hadn't even run his first senior race yet. Here's the part of this story that actually unsettles biomechanists and coaches who study it closely. After the Melbourne loss, Gout didn't go looking for a bigger, harder program. He didn't start hammering weights in a gym. He went back to Diane Shepherd and simply got sharper. That restraint, doing less, not more, is the piece that trips up a lot of experts trying to explain him. Gout stands 1.83 meters tall and weighs just 66 kilograms, lighter than almost every elite sprinter on the planet. There's no heavy barbell work in his program at all. His power comes almost entirely from technique, not raw muscle mass. His stride length measures 2.62 meters per step, longer than Usain Bolt's stride length at his own peak. His ground contact time, how long his foot actually touches the track on each step, is unusually short for a sprinter his size. Biomechanists reviewing his race footage have said his neuromuscular coordination looks like that of a 25-year-old professional, not a teenager still in high school. Some have gone so far as to say his Achilles tendon stores and releases elastic energy like a spring, possibly the most efficient they've ever measured in an athlete his age. Shepherd's program throws out the usual sprint training playbook. No heavy lifting, core stabilization, sprint drills, block starts, reaction work, mobility, and carefully structured rest. She is, in effect, protecting his body while his speed keeps building almost on its own. And it was working quietly, out of the spotlight. In February 2026, at a low-key club meet in Brisbane called the Dane Bird Smith Shield, no television cameras, no crowd, just a Saturday morning, Gout ran 10.00 seconds flat in the 100 meters. That tied the fastest legal 100 meters ever run by an Australian man on home soil. And he still had weeks of preparation left before the race that would define his year. While Gout was quietly rebuilding, Lachlan Kennedy wasn't sitting on his Melbourne win. He opened 2026 with a 20.46-second victory at the Hobart Track Classic. His 100-meter personal best sits at 9.98 seconds, one of only a handful of Australians ever to legally break 10 seconds. He holds the Australian 60-meter record at 6.43 seconds, and he'd already represented his country on Australia's 4x100-meter relay team at the 2024 Paris Olympics. Before their expected rematch, Kennedy told reporters plainly, "I am confident I will be able to defend my title." He had every reason to believe it. He had the experience. He had the result on paper. He was older, stronger, and had already beaten Gout once, fair and square, in front of the entire country. What he wasn't ready for was what Gout was quietly turning into. April 12, 2026. Sydney Olympic Park Athletics Centre. The Australian Athletics Championships, the senior national title, contested against grown men, not a junior event. Before the race, Gout wrote a single number in his notes, 19.75. He repeated it to himself every single day for a week straight. He drove hard out of the blocks, stayed low through the acceleration phase, and opened up completely down the home straight. Aidan Murphy, one of Australia's best young sprinters, pushed him hard around the bend and produced an extraordinary run of his own, 19.88 seconds, comfortably under 20, a time that would have shattered Gout's previous national record on its own. But Gout crossed the line in 19.67 seconds. He looked up at the clock and the stadium erupted. The commentator's voice cracked as he called it. "The world will be shaking. It is seismic." That time smashed the world under 20 record of 19.69 seconds, set by American sprinter Arion Knighton back in 2022. It beat Usain Bolt's own best time as a teenager, 19.93 seconds, run all the way back in 2004, by 26 hundredths of a second, a time Bolt himself never bettered as a junior. For context, 19.67 seconds would have been good enough for a bronze medal at the Paris 2024 Olympic Games. Gout Gout, an 18-year-old, ran a time that would have medaled against the best full-grown professionals on Earth 2 years earlier. After crossing the line, he told reporters exactly what he'd written in his notebook a week earlier. "I wrote down 19.75, and for the past week, I have been telling myself I am running 19.75, and obviously 19.67. You've got to love it." Notably, this time Lachlan Kennedy was not in that particular final. He had already claimed the men's 100-meter national title at the same championships, running 9.96 seconds. But it was Gout's night, without question. The reaction came in fast, from everywhere. Noah Lyles, the 8-time world champion and Paris 2024 Olympic 100-meter gold medalist, had already said publicly that Gout was more talented at the same age than Lyles himself had been. Not might be, right now already. And Usain Bolt, watching from Geneva, gave the teenager something more valuable than praise, a warning drawn from his own experience. Bolt told CNN, "At that young age, I was there myself. You start getting pulled in every direction and forget about track and field. Hopefully he has the right people around him, because if you lose track of the sport, everything else goes with it." Gout heard the noise, including the critics who tried to discount the run because of the conditions in Sydney. He answered them directly 6 days later at the Brisbane Junior Championships, running in front of his home crowd and winning the 100 meters final outright. His response to the doubters was simple: there are always going to be critics. If you have critics, it means you are doing something right. Kennedy won Melbourne. But Gout won something much bigger: a world record, a statement, and a message to every sprinter on the planet that the kid from Ipswich isn't chasing anyone anymore. To really understand how enormous April 12, 2026 was, it helps to look back at the records Gout was measuring himself against. Peter Norman, 1968. Long before Gout broke his junior 200-meter mark, Peter Norman was already an Australian sporting icon for a different reason entirely. At the 1968 Mexico City Olympics, Norman won the silver medal in the 200 meters in 20.06 seconds, an Australian record that stood for decades. He is remembered just as much for standing on the podium alongside Tommy Smith and John Carlos during their famous raised fist protest against racial injustice, wearing an Olympic Project for Human Rights badge in solidarity. That a record tied to that moment stood untouched for 56 years, until a Sudanese-Australian teenager broke it in 2024, added an extra layer of symbolism that Australian media didn't miss. Usain Bolt's junior career. Bolt was already a phenomenon as a teenager in Jamaica, but even he didn't run under 20 seconds until later in his career. His fastest time as a junior, 19.93 seconds, came in 2004 when he was 17, and it stood as the world under 20 best for the 200 meters for years afterward. Bolt would go on to run the current senior world record of 19.19 seconds as an adult at the 2009 World Championships in Berlin, still the fastest 200 meters ever run by a human being. Erriyon Knighton's under 20 mark. The record Gout actually broke on the clock, 19.69 seconds, belonged to American sprinter Erriyon Knighton, who ran it in 2022 as a teenager before going on to become a senior world championship medalist. Knighton had been considered the standard-bearer for a new generation of young sprinters until Gout's Sydney run pushed him down the all-time under 20 list. Australia's sprinting drought. For years, Australian sprinting lived in the shadow of its sporting rivals in the United States, Jamaica, and increasingly African nations. Cathy Freeman's Olympic gold in the 400 meters at the Sydney 2000 Games remains the country's most iconic individual track moment. But the men's short sprints had gone decades without producing a global contender. Gout and Lachlan Kennedy, both emerging from Queensland within a few years of each other, have effectively ended that drought at the same time, giving Australia its deepest sprinting depth in a generation heading toward the Brisbane 2032 Olympic Games on home soil. The bigger picture. Gout is reportedly skipping this year's Commonwealth Games to focus on the World Under 20 Championships in Oregon later in 2026, a deliberate, patient choice that echoes the same restraint his coach has shown throughout his career. No rush, no shortcuts, just steady sharpening of an athlete who, at 18 years old, is already being talked about as the future face of world sprinting. The kid who lost by 0.04 of a second in Melbourne didn't need a bigger gym or a louder team around him. He needed 13 months, one coach who believed in him from the very first afternoon, and one number written in a notebook. Everything else, the world just watched happen.